Hi, I'm Yvonne and I live in South Australia in a very small town away from Adelaide. That means I may or may not be online when this is shown. Obviously, I'm over the other side of the world from many of you, and so it will depend on the timing. So I'm going to talk about the Arkholme Basketmakers. That was the island family mainly, though there were other basket makers, and they were there for over 200 years. Some of them, however, moved away from the village to various towns following their trade for various reasons. And so we will look at the outcome of what happened to Arkholme basket makers. What interested me in Arkholme was my fourth great-grandfather. He was William Ireland, and when I first looked at his marriage record in the parish register, you can't probably make it out because it's not a very good copy, but he was described as a wand weaver. I wondered for a long time what a wand weaver could possibly be, and it turns out, of course, that it meant a basket maker. In fact, the term wand weaver went out of fashion, and most of them were known as basket makers. The photo here is willows along the River Lune. Arkholme is on the River Lune in Lancashire. Lancaster is not that far away, but along the river willows grow. That photo was taken in 2022. And there are still willows there, but nowhere near as many as there were in the 18th and 19th centuries. They are also now wild willows rather than cultivated. So Arkholme is here and runs down to the River Lune. For a long time, particularly on the Arkholme wastes, willows grew, and very much all along this area. You can see the term here, liable to floods. Willows do like wet feet, but not always flooded feet, and that sometimes caused issues. There was a footbridge, that goes across, then to a ferry which came across the other side, to Melling, which was the parish centre for a long time before Arkholme became a parish in its own right. That was in 1844-45. By 1890 things had changed. You can see that the River Lune has changed its direction. The ferry is over here. There's no longer a footbridge. It's thought that what happened was these changes meant that it was much harder to grow the willows required for basket making, and this could have accounted for the move of many of the families away from the original village of Arkholme to other areas. These are roughly all of the basket makers, and the photo there of a willow basket was made over 100 years ago, and a fifth cousin of mine allowed me to use the photo. He has it and finds that basket very precious given its age and the fact that it still is in pretty good condition. And this was typical of the baskets that were made at the time. On this side you can see all of the different colours. Now what they are, the basket makers who are known to definitely be basket makers are in these greens or oranges, and the reason this orange line is there is that is my direct line. William is my fourth great-grandfather, and there was never a time when there was not one of these descendants a basket maker in Arkholme from 1766 right down to Charles Taylor Island. 1902 he was born, he died in 1959. But there are obviously lots of other basket makers. These darker grey blue are people who belong to the family who were not basket makers themselves, which is not surprising for Jane and Agnes, Alice and Mary Ann, because women did not tend to turn to the trade. However, they did have children who became basket makers, and basically the main male who didn't was Robert here. His father was a basket maker and his son became a basket maker, but he wasn't. The three at the top in the paler grey are the progenitors of the known basket makers. However, basket making is usually a trade, unlike many, which was an apprenticeship, where fathers taught their sons. And it seems highly unusual that all of these three people, John, William 1752, William 1766 and Thomas, would have all become basket makers at the same time. And their records do show that they took up that profession. So the likelihood is that John and Thomas, the parents, would have been basket makers as well. So obviously basket making was very strong in Arkholme, and you can see the census figures there from 1841 to 1901 of the basket making families, and you can see that the islands were the strongest families or family who were basket makers, but there were these others, particularly the Taylors and the Murrays were other basket making families that the islands married into. So there was a tradition of the village craft of basket making, and of course basket making was very much a village craft. It was all hands-on. There was no machinery used apart from a particular platform that was used that they put the willows on to strip them. Obviously, about 1851 to 61 was the heyday of basket making, but it did continue right the way through. However, this tells another story. These were basket makers born in Arkholme who were located elsewhere in those years of the census collections. So in 1841, basket makers in Arkholme were in Arkholme. Four, and they were the same four, in 1851 and 61 had moved away. One had only moved across the river to Melling. One had gone to Yorkshire, but some had moved into towns in Lancashire. In 1871 and 81, there is a much larger increase in the number of Arkholme basket makers not living in the village of their birth, and then it dwindles off, of course. What had happened is the viaduct had gone in, the railway had gone in, and industrialisation, even though it was a small village, was beginning to occur. So where did they go? If they didn't live in Arkholme anymore, where had they moved to? Generally, they moved to towns and cities where there were cotton mills and or paper mills. Basket making was important, and you can see in the photo these are wicker skip baskets, and what happened is many of the basket makers who couldn't continue in Arkholme, probably because there weren't enough willows to support them all, would move across and work in the various cotton mills, and many of them are recorded as being there, and unfortunately there are two islands who were recorded as dying of TB who had worked in Darwin, but it is possible it was misdiagnosed and was actually cotton bisonosis, which was rife in the cotton mills because of the dust. So it wasn't a particularly healthy place to work, but that's one of the areas they moved. Another place they moved was into workshops for the blind. This is from Blackburn, And of course it has all these mills, and what's interesting is where this green line is, Thornbury Street, is where the workshop for the blind was set up, and two of the island basket makers actually worked there teaching the blind basket making, and it's probably no coincidence that they are there where the mills are. Again, the blind would have made skips or smaller baskets that were often used for collecting the rubbish under the machines to move things out, and that would be how that could have happened. During both World Wars, basket makers also worked for the war effort, and this was particularly interesting. I had not realised just how much. The basket car here is in cane and willow. That was for an air balloon, and basket makers were used for that, of course. The aeroplane seats over here, which don't look very comfortable to me, and also if anybody's being shot at, not very safe, they were also made out of wicker, I assume because they were light. The interesting one are the shell baskets. Most of the planes carried their shells in wicker baskets, and tens of thousands of these were made during the war effort. All of this helped to support basket making. Now, the Arkholme people themselves would not have been making these, but it is possible that some of the Arkholme basket makers who had moved to the towns and taken their trade with them were involved in the war effort. By the later 20th century, it can be seen how things had declined. In Arkholme, the population hadn't. It was, apart from 1911 when it was sort of in its heyday, it's a very steady population. Looking at it, it also was a very Lancashire population. Very few people from anywhere outside of Britain settled in Arkholme, and most of them were from Lancashire, and 60% of them were born in Arkholme at that time. By 1934-35, the Irelands, who were the main family, of course, had begun to decline. These were the only ones there, and in fact, the only person still a basket maker was Charles here, Charles Taylor Island. Thomas had been one, so had William, so had Richard, and so had John, but they were all retired by this stage. So although it was still in Arkholme, generally there had been a move away from the village to the towns. And Charles was the last of the village basket makers, as is recorded on his headstone. And in a newspaper report, it said that they, instead of doing what they'd used to, skips went for the fishing trawlers, he made pet baskets, so there were changes in how they made their baskets. And then this is my transcription. The font has a lid which says it's in memory of Charles Taylor Island, and he was a friend of children, and he served his village with untiring devotion. Clearly, basket making was very important to Arkholme, and it was wonderful that it managed to stay in the village even when most of them left and went to the towns. Thank you very much. That is my email should you want to contact me, and I hope you have learned a little bit about the Arkholme basket makers.